The most inbred monarchs in European history. Welcome, welcome. You've stumbled into another one of those long, meandering history rambles that you probably won't remember in the morning. That's fine. You don't need to. My goal is to be less like a riveting lecture, and more like that background murmur you half hear while drifting into sleep. So, settle in. Get comfortable. Maybe sip some water. Or tea. Just not coffee. Unless you're trying to stay awake while learning about centuries of royals who couldn't stop marrying their cousins. Yes, tonight we're talking about inbreeding. Specifically the inbred monarchs of Europe. You've probably heard jokes about the Hapsburg jaw, or maybe you know the story of the sickly Spanish kings. But the truth is, it gets stranger, sadder, and honestly more absurd than most people realise. Royal families, obsessed with keeping bloodlines pure, ended up tying themselves into knots. They married within the same few dynasties for generation after generation, and, surprise, genetics had a few opinions about that. Now, before we wander into the palaces and bedrooms of these unfortunate monarchs, let's gently acknowledge something. We are not mocking people for being disabled, sickly, or struggling with fertility. That was their reality, and it was often tragic. What we can poke at is the sheer stubbornness of royal houses who refuse to stop playing matchmaker with their nieces and nephews, as if the family tree wasn't already looking more like a family wreath. So let's ease into the first example, perhaps the most infamous poster child of royal inbreeding. Spain's Charles II. Poor Charles, known to history with the delightful nickname El Hechizado, bewitched. Not exactly the legacy anyone wants. Charles II of Spain was born in 1661, the only surviving son of Philip IV of Spain and Mariana of Austria. Right away, that pairing should raise eyebrows. Mariana was Philip's niece. Yes, his niece. Which makes Charles's family tree a tight little loop. By the time Charles came along, the Spanish Hapsburgs had been practicing close quarters marriage for centuries, and the results were written all over him. Contemporaries described Charles as frail, with a huge head, a weak chin, and that famous Habsburg jaw. So pronounced, it basically had its own postcode. He had trouble chewing food, trouble speaking clearly, and trouble walking. He didn't start talking until the age of 4, didn't walk until he was 8, which, for a future king, is not the best start. And if you're thinking, well, maybe he grew out of it, no. Charles lived a life defined by illness and infertility. His teeth never lined up, so he could barely chew. He had chronic digestive issues. And of course, the all-important royal duty of producing heirs. He failed. He was married twice, once to Marie-Louise of Orléans, and later to Maria Anna of Neuburg. Both women reported the same problem. Charles was impotent. He spent years being dragged through bizarre medical treatments and rituals to fix this supposed curse. At one point, court physicians even recommended feeding him powdered human skulls, because obviously nothing helps fertility like a sprinkle of grave dust in your breakfast. Despite these efforts, Charles never fathered children, which meant the Spanish Habsburg line ended with him in 1700. His death triggered the War of the Spanish Succession, a massive conflict that reshaped European politics for decades. So yes, a weak chin and bad genetics had global consequences. It's easy to imagine Charles as just a tragic figure, but there's something quietly absurd about the way his courts handled him. Imagine being a king who can barely walk while your doctors and priests argue over whether you're bewitched or just suffering from, centuries of your family marrying its own cousins. But that was the mindset. Everything was spiritual, magical, or cursed. Genetics as a concept wasn't part of their world. Now Charles was extreme, but he wasn't alone. The entire Hapsburg dynasty across Spain and Austria had this problem. The family tree basically folded in on itself. One genealogical study estimated Charles's inbreeding coefficient, the measure of how closely related your parents are, at around 0.25. That's the same as if your parents were brother and sister, which, again, they technically weren't. But after enough generations of uncle-niece marriages, the math catches up. Let's drift gently sideways, because Spain wasn't the only royal house determined to play genetic roulette. Over in Austria, the Habsburgs continued their tradition of chin-forward marriage practices. But to keep things sleepy, let's take our time getting there. Imagine the candlelit halls, the endless portraits of pale-faced royals with elongated jaws and heavy-lidded eyes, the pomp and pageantry covering up what was, at the genetic level, a very small gene pool sloshing around. Another example worth mentioning is the marriage of Philip II of Spain, Charles's grandfather. Philip married 4 times, but his third wife was Anna of Austria, his niece. Again, the family seemed allergic to marrying anyone outside their tiny club. Their son was Philip III, who inherited both the throne and a slightly more watered-down version of the family jaw. Philip III actually lived a relatively normal life, but his son Philip IV ramped the inbreeding right back up by marrying his niece Mariana, the pairing that produced our poor Charles. The thing is, in their minds, this wasn't reckless. It was about politics. Royals believed that marrying cousins or nieces kept power consolidated within the dynasty. It was strategic, not personal. But in reality, they were stacking the genetic deck against their children, generation after generation. Let's pause here, because you might be wondering, was Charles II the most inbred monarch in history? Possibly, but not definitively. He's the most famous case, thanks to his visible disabilities and his failure to produce heirs. But there were plenty of others scattered across Europe's dynasties, some just as tangled. And so, while Charles is our dramatic opening act, we'll gently float onward. We'll keep wandering through these candlelit corridors of royal dysfunction. Ahead, we'll find other monarchs whose family trees looked more like a tightly wound spiral staircase. Kings of Portugal who doubled up on cousins. Archdukes of Austria with jaws so square they could barely close their mouths. Even the supposedly glamorous French Bourbons, who weren't entirely free of this habit. But we'll keep the pace slow, like a carriage ride over cobblestones, because that's what you need right now. Nothing shocking, just a quiet, monotonous parade of royals making one questionable marriage decision after another. And so, having lingered with poor Charles, we'll next drift toward Austria to see what his relatives were up to. Spoiler, it involves more cousins, more jaws, and more questionable medical practices. But let's save that for the next part of our journey. So, let's move quietly from Spain to Austria. Same family, just different palaces and fresher wallpaper. If the Spanish Habsburgs gave us Charles the Bewitched, the Austrian branch carried on the fine tradition of looking at an already crumpled gene pool and thinking, yes. Let's stir it again. Austria's Habsburgs were especially proud of their chins. which, if you look at portraits, are less chins and more architectural features. Heavy, protruding jaws that seem to belong on a stone gargoyle rather than a human face. The so-called Hapsburg jaw became a dynasty trademark. Sculptors tried to soften it, painters politely ignored it, but genetics refused to play along. Let's consider Emperor Leopold I. Born in 1640, Leopold was the son of Ferdinand III and Maria Anna of Spain. Yes, that's right. His mother was Spanish Hapsburg, because these families just couldn't stop passing nieces back and forth across borders like awkward Christmas gifts. Leopold's portraits show him with a lower lip that could probably store a week's worth of leftovers. He had the full jaw, drooping eyes, an overall look of a man who'd spent too much time marrying his own reflection. But Leopold had other quirks. He was deeply pious, bordering on gloomy. He enjoyed music and patronised the arts, which is nice, but he also had the kind of obsessive religiosity that made him a joyless dinner guest. He married 3 times, with his first wife being, of course, his niece, Margarita Teresa of Spain. At this point, the Habsburgs weren't even trying to hide it. Margarita was also Leopold's cousin, for good measure, because why stop at 1 degree of relation when you can double up? Leopold and Margarita's marriage was portrayed as a grand romantic union, but in reality, Margarita was just 15 when she wed her 30-year-old uncle. Not exactly a fairy tale. She gave birth to several children, most of whom died in infancy, which was sadly common in this family. After Margarita died young, Leopold remarried twice more, this time at least branching out slightly, though still within the usual cousin-adjacent circles. What makes Leopold memorable in this parade of inbreeding is how visibly the dynasty's features dominated his line. His children carried forward the jaw, the lips, the general air of wilted candle wax. By the 18th century, the Austrian Habsburgs looked like a single extended family portrait, where everyone had melted slightly in the sun. But the Habsburg jaw wasn't just cosmetic. It often came with misaligned teeth, difficulty chewing, and speech problems. Chronic inbreeding tends to amplify recessive traits, and this was the dynasty's calling card. Imagine being a royal ambassador, trying to have delicate negotiations with a monarch who can't close his mouth properly. That was Europe's diplomatic reality for centuries. Now, Austria wasn't the only place where this was happening. The Portuguese royal family had their own tangled knots. King Afonso VI, born in 1643, was so disabled he could barely walk or use his right side. He also suffered from mental instability and, by most accounts, was sexually impotent. His marriage to Marie-Françoise of Savoy fell apart quickly. She had it annulled, claiming the king was unable to consummate it, and then she married his younger brother, which, awkward, but also very on-brand for these dynasties. Afonso's disabilities weren't random misfortune. They were likely worsened by the same inbreeding patterns we've already seen. Portugal's royals repeatedly married Spanish Habsburgs, so their family trees overlapped until children were being born with the combined genetic baggage of both branches. Afonso's reign was short and sad, his power eventually taken by his brother. He spent his later years confined, essentially sidelined, while still technically king. But if Portugal and Spain gave us fragile monarchs, Austria gave us stubborn ones. Take Maria Theresa, for example, the famous Habsburg empress of the 18th century. She was formidable, pragmatic, and one of the most powerful rulers of her time. Yet even she couldn't resist the dynastic marriage trap. She married Francis Stephen of Lorraine, which at least widened the gene pool slightly, but she arranged her children's marriages with the same old obsession, alliances over health. Her daughter Marie Antoinette ended up in France, as we all know, and that didn't go spectacularly well either. Speaking of France, the Bourbons weren't completely free of cousin collecting. Louis XIV, the Sun King, married Maria Theresa of Spain. She was his double first cousin, because both of their parents were siblings, double cousins. That means they shared more DNA than the average sibling pair, which is one way to make a family reunion complicated. Their marriage was meant to seal peace between France and Spain, but it also sealed their family's resemblance to each other a bit more tightly. The Sun King himself seemed robust enough, but his descendants carried forward the weakened genetic hand. The Bourbon line would later suffer similar problems of child mortality, infertility, and illness. By the time you get to Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, the line wasn't quite as fragile as Spain's, but it still bore the marks of too much cousin love. Let's drift back toward Austria for one more moment though, because the dynasty gave us one of history's longest chins. Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor in the 16th century, was an earlier example of the Hapsburg jaw in full bloom. His lower jaw was so pronounced that his upper and lower teeth didn't meet. He had trouble speaking clearly, which made commanding troops or giving speeches a bit of an adventure. Chronic indigestion plagued him, possibly because chewing food into digestible pieces was a constant struggle. Charles V was also plagued by gout, another common royal affliction worsened by diet and genetics. He eventually abdicated, retiring to a monastery where he spent his last years in pain, swollen and weakened. His portraits, though, tell you everything about the dynasty's look. Long, pale face, drooping eyes, and a jaw that looked like it could break walnuts without assistance. So, if Spain gave us the tragic Charles II, Austria gave us an entire dynasty of gradually drooping faces. And through it all, the pattern repeats. Nieces marrying uncles, cousins marrying cousins, sisters promised to their own nephews. The obsession with dynastic consolidation created a loop that no one seemed willing to break. Let's gently step sideways now, because we haven't yet touched on the royals of Central Europe. The Wittelsbachs of Bavaria also dabbled in cousin marriages, though not as spectacularly as the Hapsburgs. They left more of a reputation for eccentric behaviour than visible deformities, but one branch, tied closely with Austria, occasionally dipped into the same shallow gene pool, and the results were predictable. Fragile health, mental instability, shortened lives. And then, of course, there's the Russian royal family. By the time you get to the Romanovs of the 19th century, they had mixed with enough German princesses to bring Hapsburg genes eastward. Tsar Nicholas II's wife, Alexandra, was granddaughter of Queen Victoria, tying Russia into the sprawling web of European cousin marriages. Their son Alexei, the haemophiliac heir, is a famous example of how genetic disorders spread through inbred lines. Haemophilia became known as the royal disease, traced back to Victoria and carried through intermarriage across Europe. We'll get there later, but it's worth noting here, inbreeding didn't always mean visible jaws or dramatic deformities. Sometimes it was quieter: fragile blood, weak immunity, children dying in infancy. adults collapsing from strokes at 30. Genetics isn't theatrical, it's persistent. So, let's recap softly, without any sense of drama. Spain gave us Charles the Bewitched, whose parents were uncle and niece. Austria gave us Leopold, whose chin could stop traffic. Portugal handed us Afonso VI, paralysed and impotent. France joined in with Louis XIV, marrying his double cousin. And all of it, generation after generation, came from the same obsession with purity. Royal blood had to remain royal, no matter how many birth defects piled up. What's striking, when you float through this history, is how few people seemed to recognise the pattern. Children kept dying, kings kept collapsing, doctors kept inventing bizarre treatments, blaming curses or witches. Nobody pointed out the obvious. Maybe, just maybe, marrying your niece isn't the best strategy for genetic resilience. But of course, dynastic politics drowned out biology. As we continue drifting, we'll see how this obsession reached England and the German states. We'll meet monarchs who are not only inbred, but also frankly, just eccentric. Because sometimes genetics doesn't just warp the jawline, it twists the personality too. But we'll save that for the next quiet stretch of our long and winding story. For now, imagine the portraits hanging in dimly lit palaces, candlelight flickering on identical noses, jaws and eyes, faces repeating like photocopies of photocopies, fading a little more with each generation. It's eerie, and also a little funny, in that darkly ironic way history tends to be. And with that picture in mind, let's gently wander forward to see how the inbreeding web reached across Britain, Germany, and eventually into Russia's tragic royal family. So, let's slowly leave the candlelit palaces of Austria and France behind and wander northward toward Britain and Germany. Different accents, different architecture, but the same old royal habit of treating the family tree like a very small circle. We should probably start with Britain's favourite queen, Victoria. She reigned for most of the 19th century, giving her name to an era of industrial revolution, empire and prudish furniture design. But beyond the politics and portraits, Victoria is famous for passing along one of the most dreaded hereditary conditions of her age, haemophilia. Haemophilia is a blood disorder where clotting doesn't work properly, which means a simple bruise could turn into internal bleeding, and a minor cut might be fatal. It was often called the royal disease because of how it spread among Europe's monarchies, and it all began with Victoria. The story goes that the mutation first appeared in her. She didn't inherit it from either parent, which makes her what's known as a spontaneous mutation. Nature just rolled the dice that day. But the moment Victoria had it, she carried it into Europe's already tangled dynastic web. Because of course she married her first cousin, Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. Together they had 9 children, and those children married into basically every major royal house on the continent. Victoria's daughters carried the haemophilia gene to Spain, to Germany, and most fatefully to Russia. Suddenly, royal heirs across Europe were fragile, bruising, bleeding, and dying young. Victoria may not have had the Hapsburg jaw, but her genetic legacy was just as dramatic. Let's pause on Russia for a moment, because it's the most famous case. Alexandra, granddaughter of Victoria, married Tsar Nicholas II. She carried the haemophilia gene, and their only son, Alexei, inherited the disease. Alexei's childhood was defined by pain and risk. A fall from a horse or even a bump on the knee could trigger life-threatening bleeding. This made the Russian throne precarious. A single accident could wipe out the heir. Desperate for solutions, Alexandra turned to faith healers and mystics. Enter Rasputin, the bearded wanderer, whose supposed ability to soothe Alexei's suffering earned him enormous influence over the royal family. And we all know how that story ended. Revolution, execution, and Rasputin's corpse floating down the river. But at the heart of it all was haemophilia, passed down from cousin marriages that spread Victoria's bloodline like ivy through the royal houses. Without that disease, maybe Rasputin would never have risen. Maybe Russian politics would have taken a different turn. History has a way of pivoting on things as small as a gene. Spain also got its share of haemophilia through Victoria's descendants. Victoria's daughter Beatrice carried the gene into the Spanish royal family. Her son Alfonso, Prince of Asturias, was affected. He died young after a minor car accident, bleeding uncontrollably because of his condition. Imagine that, the heir to the Spanish throne, taken not by war or plague, but by a bad bruise that his body couldn't repair. Germany too received its royal dose. Victoria's daughter Alice married into the Hessian line, carrying haemophilia there. Several of Alice's children suffered from it, including Prince Friedrich, who died at just 2 years old after falling out of a window. One slip, one ordinary childhood accident, and his blood couldn't clot. So, what we see with Victoria is not the grotesque jaws, twisted faces of the Hapsburgs, but something subtler and more insidious. A hidden condition that undermined dynasties from within. It's another kind of royal fragility, spreading quietly through cousin marriages and strategic unions. Britain itself, though, was not free from the cousin habit. The Hanoverian kings before Victoria already showed signs of the dangers. George III, famous for losing the American colonies and for his bouts of madness, is often brought up in this context. Historians now think his illness may have been porphyria, a genetic blood disorder. Symptoms include abdominal pain, hallucinations, and nervous system issues. His fits of mania, talking for hours, foaming at the mouth, losing his grip on reality, were probably not helped by the fact that he, too, came from a family tree with fewer branches than ideal. George's granddaughter, Queen Victoria herself, married her cousin Albert, repeating the pattern. Their match was presented as a great romance, Albert playing the role of a supportive, reform-minded husband, and it was, by royal standards, affectionate. But genetically speaking, it was yet another loop in the tangled web. Germany, meanwhile, produced some spectacularly odd royals. The House of Hohenzollern, rulers of Prussia, had their own share of eccentricity. Kaiser Wilhelm II, Victoria's grandson, grew up with a withered arm from a botched birth delivery. He compensated with arrogance and bluster, strutting around like a military peacock. His personality quirks, volatile, insecure, prone to tantrums, were possibly his own, but it's hard not to see the family pattern of fragile health creeping into yet another heir. What's striking about all this is how normal it seemed to them. Cousins marrying cousins wasn't considered scandalous, it was expected. Marrying outside the royal circle risked diluting royal blood, which to them was the greatest horror. So instead they chose the slow-motion disaster of concentrating genetic disorders in their families. You can almost picture a royal council congratulating themselves on another successful cousin marriage, while an unseen gene quietly sharpened its knife in the corner. Let's float back to Britain again, because we haven't yet lingered enough on Victoria's brood. Her son Edward VII inherited the throne, though by then the haemophilia gene seemed to have skipped him. He was robust, at least compared to some of his relatives, and more interested in parties and mistresses than politics. But his siblings carried the curse far and wide. Victoria Eugenie of Battenberg, another granddaughter, married King Alfonso XIII of Spain. She carried haemophilia into that line, producing sons who were afflicted and died young. Her marriage was overshadowed by the constant fear of her children's deaths. Alfonso XIII reportedly blamed her cruelly for bringing the disease into Spain. Meanwhile, in Germany, Alice's descendants suffered as well. The family endured child after child born fragile, some living only a few years. For them, royal blood was less a blessing than a ticking time bomb. So, while the Hapsburgs wore their inbreeding on their faces, with jaws that artists struggled to paint politely, Victoria's legacy was more hidden, but no less tragic. Behind the ornate palaces, behind the stiff portraits, were children dying young, heirs bruising and bleeding, mothers wringing their hands in despair. By the early 20th century, it became clear that keeping blood pure was actually poisoning it. But by then, it was too late. Dynasties fell not only from wars and revolutions, but from within, undone by their own stubborn refusal to widen the family circle. Let's keep the pace calm here. Imagine these families sitting for portraits, stiff and solemn, while knowing their heir might not live to adulthood. Imagine the long corridors of palaces echoing with anxious whispers about another child coughing blood. This wasn't just bad luck. It was deliberate, repeated, institutionalized inbreeding. And no amount of gold, no number of palaces could protect them from the consequences. And yet, they kept doing it. Even after centuries of fragile heirs and tragic deaths, cousin marriages continued well into the 20th century. Tradition, politics, and ego outweighed the evidence. History, as always, moved forward in its own sleepy, repetitive loop. So now, with Britain, Germany, and Russia tangled up in Victoria's genetic shadow, we can gently wander further. Ahead lie more monarchs worth mentioning, eccentrics, tragedies, and dynasties unravelling under the weight of their own bloodlines. We'll float into the later Romanovs, the collapsing Austrians, and eventually toward the quieter ironies of modern royals who, at last, started marrying outside their cousin pool. But for now, let's rest with this thought, that one queen, Victoria, sitting on her throne in a stiff black dress, unknowingly reshaped the health of half of Europe's monarchies. Not through politics, but through a single mutated gene, and through the relentless insistence that family must always marry family. Let's wander gently eastward again, back into Russia.
We already met young Alexei, the bleeding heir, whose illness helped Rasputin creep his way into royal favor. But the Romanovs as a whole were a genetic experiment gone badly sideways. Nicholas II, the last Tsar, was the great-grandson of Queen Victoria, which means he was part of that same tangled family web. His wife, Alexandra, was also Victoria's granddaughter. So yes, Nicholas and Alexandra were both descendants of Victoria, just through different branches, which technically makes them cousins, naturally, of course, because apparently No monarch in the 19th century could look at someone outside the family tree without feeling faint. Their marriage produced 4 daughters and 1 son. The daughters, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia, were healthy enough, but Alexei inherited the dreaded hemophilia gene. His life was fragile from the beginning. The imperial court lived in constant fear of accidents. Servants padded furniture, discouraged rough play, and whispered prayers over him. Yet, inevitably, he suffered frequent bleeds. Once, he nearly died after a carriage accident caused internal hemorrhaging. The empire held its breath, while a child's body leaked blood it could not replace. This fragility shaped politics in quiet but enormous ways. Alexandra, desperate for any solution, turned to the strange Siberian monk named Grigory Rasputin. Rasputin convinced her that he could soothe Alexei's pain through prayer and touch. Sometimes, by coincidence or by sheer luck, Alexei's bleeding did ease after Rasputin's interventions, which was enough to cement his power at court. Alexandra trusted him completely. Nicholas tolerated him reluctantly, and the rest of Russia, watching from the outside, saw a mad monk with greasy hair controlling the Tsarina. Not a great look when your empire is already tottering on revolution. The irony is almost too neat. Centuries of inbreeding, generations of fragile heirs, and it all culminates in a single boy's illness, helping to topple a 300-year dynasty. By 1917, the Romanovs were swept aside. Revolutionaries had no patience for fragile czars, bleeding heirs, or mystics muttering in darkened rooms. And in 1918, the whole family was executed in a basement. The royal disease ended with them, along with the dynasty. A grim conclusion, tied directly back to a gene carried out of Britain by Queen Victoria. Now, while Russia was unraveling, Germany was busy imploding in its own way. Kaiser Wilhelm II, Victoria's grandson, led Germany into World War I with more bravado than competence. His withered arm, the result of a difficult birth, had left him insecure his entire life. Some say it fueled his aggressive militarism. Others think he was simply an unpleasant man, amplified by absolute power. Either way, he's another example of how Europe's ruling houses produced heirs, both physically and psychologically, complicated. If you step back and look at Europe around 1900, it becomes almost comical. The kings and queens of Britain, Germany, and Russia were all cousins. They wrote letters to each other, addressing one another as Nicky, Willie, and Georgie. On the eve of World War I, the leaders sending millions of men to die were all basically arguing family business. Cousin against cousin, squabbling over territory, while their faces all looked eerily similar thanks to generations of cousin marriage. Britain's King George V, Nicholas II of Russia, and Wilhelm II of Germany were all related. You could swap them into a family reunion, and they'd look like variations of the same man. The same beards, the same noses, the same eyes, staring out of different uniforms. The war wasn't just political, it was a family spat taken global, a cousinly disagreement with artillery. Meanwhile, in the smaller German states, inbreeding continued with its usual quiet determination. The Saxe-Coburgs, the Hesses, the Mecklenburgs, tiny duchies and principalities, all busily marrying each other's daughters and sons. Half of them had Victoria somewhere in their bloodline by then. It was like an endless game of genetic musical chairs. And when the music stopped, someone inevitably collapsed from gout, porphyria, or hemophilia. If you think this is all tragic, you're right. But it's also a little absurd. These families insisted on being the guardians of Europe, the chosen rulers by divine right. And yet they could barely produce heirs who could survive childhood. They had palaces full of gold and armies at their command, but not enough imagination to marry someone who wasn't their cousin. By the 20th century, though, the tide was turning. Monarchs who survived World War I began loosening the rules. The sheer disaster of cousin marriages was hard to ignore. Britain's royal family, for instance, eventually allowed marriages outside of the tight royal pool.
Prince Philip, who married Queen Elizabeth II, was technically still a distant cousin, but by then the pool had widened enough to dilute most of the worst effects. But let's not jump too far ahead. We should linger a bit more in the twilight of inbred dynasties, because the stories are both sad and strangely hypnotic. Take, for example, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the man whose assassination triggered World War I. He wasn't inbred himself to any alarming degree, but his family background still carried the Hapsburg jaw and all its quirks. The assassination that ended his life wasn't genetic, it was political. Yet in a way, even that moment ties back to inbreeding, because Austria-Hungary's fragile, stagnant empire was the product of centuries of dynastic marriages, a patchwork quilt of territories held together by cousin unions, until it all came apart in Sarajevo in 1914. And then there's poor Otto of Bavaria, one of the Wittelsbachs, declared insane, confined for much of his reign. Otto represents the mental instability that often crept into royal bloodlines. His uncle, Ludwig II, builder of Neuschwanstein, the fairy tale castle, was also eccentric to the point of dysfunction. Were their conditions purely genetic? Not entirely, but centuries of limited gene pools certainly didn't help. Bavaria became another cautionary tale of crowns sitting heavy on fragile heads. By the early 20th century, Europe's monarchies were collapsing one after another. Russia gone. Germany's Kaiser abdicated. Austria-Hungary dissolved. Spain floundering. The survivors, like Britain, learned slowly, sometimes reluctantly, that marrying outside the cousin circle might be wise. It's almost funny that the lesson took so long. Ordinary peasants knew not to marry too close within the village. Royals, apparently, never got the memo. Let's bring this part to a slow landing, like a carriage rolling into a courtyard. We've wandered through Spain's bewitched king, Austria's long-jawed emperors, Portugal's paralysed monarchs, France's double-cousin weddings, Britain's hemophiliac princes, Germany's insecure Kaiser, and Russia's bleeding heir. All of them tangled, all of them fragile, all of them stubbornly clinging to the illusion of purity. And still, we're not finished. Ahead lies the quieter modern era, where royals began to step cautiously into wider marriage pools. Some managed to dilute their genetic legacies. Others carried on the shadows of inbreeding into the 20th century. We'll meet a few more odd monarchs, trace the last echoes of the Hapsburg jaw, and then, finally, settle into the calmer world of modern royals who, at long last, realised that marrying your cousin isn't the best plan. But that's for another gentle stretch of this ramble. For now, picture Europe's royal cousins, sitting stiffly in their uniforms and gowns, raising glasses at a family dinner, and then declaring war on each other the next morning. A continent ruled by one family, undone by its own shrinking bloodline. So here we are, drifting into the 20th century. The age of powdered wigs, candlelit corridors, and endless cousin weddings is starting to fade. But before we tuck the story away, there are still a few more royals to visit, lingering examples of how centuries of inbreeding left their marks right up to the modern era. The early 1900s were rough on monarchies. The First World War swept away crowns like autumn leaves. Russia's Romanovs, gone. Germany's Kaiser, gone. Austria, Hungary, dissolved. The surviving monarchies had to adapt or risk the same fate. And one of the quiet ways they adapted was finally looking outside the family tree when it came to marriage. But before we get there, let's pause with a few stragglers. Royals who carried the last heavy shadows of genetic bottlenecking. Take the Austrian Hapsburgs. Always dependable when you need a chin that could double as a bookshelf. By the late 19th century, their features had become almost caricatures of themselves. Emperor Franz Joseph, who ruled for nearly 70 years, still had that long jawline, though softened slightly compared to Charles V or Leopold I. His son, Crown Prince Rudolf, seemed less obviously marked, but Rudolf's tragic end at Mayerling in 1889 had nothing to do with jaws or genetics. Instead, it was a grim love affair ending in a double suicide, or murder-suicide, depending on which historian you ask. Even in their tragedies, the Habsburgs couldn't quite escape drama. Franz Joseph's nephew, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, we already touched on. Not particularly inbred himself, at least not to the alarming levels of his forebears, but still carrying the long family shadow. His marriage to Sophie Chotek, a noble woman but not royal enough, was considered scandalous. He insisted on marrying for love, which in Hapsburg terms was basically revolutionary. Their children were denied full dynastic rights, because heaven forbid the bloodline get diluted by mere nobility. And then, of course, the assassination in Sarajevo ended him and triggered the First World War. It's almost ironic. Centuries of desperate cousin marriages to preserve dynastic power. And yet the empire ended not because of weak heirs, but because one relatively healthy heir decided to marry a woman who wasn't his cousin. A rare attempt at branching out, cut short by bullets. History does love its little jokes. Now, speaking of the early 20th century, let's look briefly at Spain again. Remember Charles the Bewitched? Spain's royals eventually transitioned to the Bourbon line, but the ghosts of hemophilia haunted them thanks to Queen Victoria's descendants. King Alfonso XIII, who reigned during the early 1900s, married Victoria Eugenia Battenberg, one of Victoria's granddaughters, and with her came the gene. Their firstborn son, Alfonso, Prince of Asturias, inherited haemophilia. He lived under constant threat of bleeding to death from the simplest injuries. And indeed, in 1938, he died from internal bleeding after a minor car accident. The heir to the Spanish throne, undone not by civil war or assassination, but by a genetic condition brought into the dynasty through centuries of cousin marriages and one unlucky mutation. Alfonso XIII had other sons who also carried the gene, leaving the family line precarious. Spain, meanwhile, lurched into civil war and dictatorship. The monarchy stumbled, exiled, restored, and wobbled again. Royal blood was supposed to be a shield. Instead, it turned out to be a liability. Let's move north for a moment to Britain. By the 20th century, Britain's royals had noticed, belatedly, that marrying your cousins over and over again wasn't going great. George V, ruling through World War I, was a cousin to both Wilhelm II of Germany and Nicholas II of Russia. Family dinners must have been awkward. He survived his reign without obvious genetic collapse, but his relatives carried the scars. By mid-century, the British monarchy had finally loosened the reins. Elizabeth II, our late Queen, married Philip Mountbatten, who, yes, was still technically her cousin. But by then, the degree of relation was distant enough that the gene pool had at least expanded a little. Philip himself descended from Greek and Danish royalty, with a dash of German, which still kept the family in the same club, but at least avoided the tight uncle-niece loops of the Hapsburg days. Even with this slow broadening, the legacy of inbreeding clung on. Hemophilia, carried through Victoria's line, continued to pop up in European royals into the 20th century. Fragile children, anxious heirs, quiet hospital visits. The public image was pomp and pageantry. Private reality was fear of bruises turning fatal. Over in the smaller German states, some families simply fizzled out. Too few heirs, too many illnesses. Titles passed to distant cousins, lines merged, dynasties ended quietly. The once mighty ruling houses of Central Europe shrank back into obscurity. All the careful cousin marriages in the world couldn't save them from their own genetic fragility or from Republican revolutions sweeping the continent. So by the mid-20th century, inbreeding was no longer fashionable. Royals began marrying commoners, slowly at first, then with increasing enthusiasm. Scandals still erupted, marriages to devotees, actresses, or even just ordinary aristocrats caused gasps. But compared to uncle-niece weddings, it was progress. The gene pool, after centuries of shrinking, finally began to widen. Still, echoes of the old ways remain. If you look closely at modern royals, you can trace lineages back through the same loops we've been drifting through tonight. Elizabeth II and Prince Philip were both great-great-grandchildren of Queen Victoria. King Charles III today still carries that web of connections tying Britain, Germany, Denmark and Russia into one long family. The difference is, the dilution is finally enough that children are born without jaws jutting out at improbable angles or blood refusing to clot. And so, the story of inbreeding in Europe's monarchies doesn't end with one dramatic crash, but with a slow, sleepy fade. Cousins gradually gave way to commoners. Fragile heirs gave way to sturdier descendants. The palaces still stand, but the obsession with pure royal blood has quietly dissolved into history. Before we wrap up though, we'll drift through just one more part, because it's worth closing gently, not with tragedy, but with reflection. A calm final look at what this centuries-long experiment in dynastic inbreeding tells us not just about kings and queens, but about the strange human urge to preserve purity at all costs, even when it leads to ruin. So let's rest here for a moment, on the edge of modernity, the last fragile heirs fading away, the crowns wobbling, the old portraits of long-jawed monarchs gathering dust. In the next and final part, we'll tuck the story in and draw the curtains. A last soft sigh from centuries of cousins marrying cousins before we drift into sleep. So here we are, in the last stretch of our long walk through Europe's palaces, castles, and cousin-filled ballrooms. The story of royal inbreeding has carried us from medieval dynasties clinging desperately to thrones, to modern monarchies learning, finally, that the family tree needs more than just one or two branches. It might be tempting to laugh at the absurdity of it all, And in truth, there's plenty to smirk at. Kings marrying their nieces, queens passing on deadly genes, entire dynasties ruled by men whose jaws made chewing difficult. The sheer stubbornness of it, generation after generation insisting that purity meant marrying the closest relative available. You almost want to shake them and say, you know there are other people out there, right? But they didn't see it that way. To them, the bloodline was sacred. Keeping it pure was more important than health, happiness, or even survival. And yet, the results speak for themselves. Spain's Charles the Bewitched, barely able to function as a king. Austria's Leopold with his jutting chin, his descendants staggering under the same deformity. Britain's haemophiliac princes, their bodies betraying them before they could rule. Russia's little Alexei, a boy whose blood would not clot, his illness pulling a mystic into the heart of an empire and nudging a dynasty off a cliff. The irony is almost poetic. In trying so hard to preserve their power, these families planted the seeds of their own weakness. They thought they were building eternal dynasties. What they really built was a fragile house of cards. And one by one, across the 20th century, those cards came tumbling down. Of course, not every monarchy disappeared. Britain's still here. Denmark, Norway, the Netherlands, Spain again, in a different form. They survive, but only because they adapted. The old obsession with cousin marriage gave way to something closer to normal human choices. Marrying outside the narrow royal pool, letting the bloodline widen, even, eventually, accepting commoners into the family. What once would have been scandalous is now a sign of progress. Kate Middleton was not a princess, neither was Meghan Markle. And yet, the monarchy carries on. If you compare the portraits of Charles V or Charles II of Spain to photographs of today's royal children, you can almost feel the relief. Their faces look ordinary, which is a blessing. No more massive jaws, no more swollen tongues, no more fragile children doomed by recessive genes, colliding again and again. Just kids who happen to live in palaces, looking like any other children you might pass on the street. And maybe that's the real lesson tucked inside this long, drowsy story. Power, wealth, divine right, all of it can crumble if the foundations are weak. And when your foundation is a family tree that looks less like a tree and more like a tangled wreath, collapse is almost inevitable. It's easy to treat it as grotesque comedy, and in some ways it is. But it's also quietly tragic. Behind every joke about the Hapsburg jaw or the bewitched king, there was a real person, often suffering, often lonely, often aware that they weren't like others. They bore the weight of crowns they didn't choose, carried illnesses they couldn't avoid, and were used as pawns in dynastic games they had no control over. The grandeur of their lives hid the fragility of their bodies. And so, after centuries of cousin marriages, the story winds down into a softer present. A world where kings and queens are mostly symbolic, where the idea of pure blood has been left in the past, and where genetic health has quietly improved simply because someone finally had the courage to marry outside the family. As we close the curtains on this tale, you might picture the great portraits hanging in dusty galleries. Long lines of monarchs stare back, chins protruding, eyes weary, crowns heavy. They were the products of their time, prisoners of their traditions, bound by the invisible chains of dynasty. They ruled vast empires, yet they couldn't escape their own blood.
Now, their stories are just that. Stories. Stories we tell at night, in quiet voices. letting the absurdity and sadness flow together until they blur. The age of inbred monarchs has passed. Their palaces remain, their portraits remain, but their genetic experiments have ended. What's left for us is the strange comfort of knowing that even the most powerful can undo themselves with their own stubbornness. And with that, we've reached the end of our long ramble through the most inbred monarchs in European history. The candles have burned low, the carriages have rolled away, the portraits hang silent in the dark. It's time to let the story settle, like dust drifting down in an abandoned hall. If you like our video, don't forget to like and subscribe and press the first icon button. Close your eyes now. Let the voices of long-dead kings fade into the background. Their jaws, their illnesses, their dynasties collapsing. It's all far away now. Just a quiet echo, a soft reminder that history is full of strange experiments, some of which are better left behind. Rest easy. The monarchs are gone. The story is finished, and sleep is waiting.